That Thanksgiving night, the air was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that burns the skin before you even realize you're freezing. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at Street Helena General, the smell of antiseptic and coffee still clinging to my scrubs. The roads were slick with ice, and every streetlight shimmered like a frozen tear. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, I saw the house glowing gold and warm laughter spilling out from behind the windows. For a moment, I almost smiled. Then I saw the small shape curled up on the front step, my son Eli, 9 years old. Barefoot, shaking, lips purple like bruised plums. I dropped my keys, ran to him, and pulled him into my arms. His skin was ice. Eli, baby, what happened? He could barely speak. Grandma said I needed to learn. I didn't let him finish. I scooped him up, my hands trembling. When I looked through the frosted window, I saw my family, the same people I'd trusted with my child, passing gravy, raising glasses, laughing around the turkey dinner I'd paid $8,000 for. Not one of them looked toward the door. I pushed it open. The warmth hit me like a slap, and the laughter stopped midair. I looked at them, my mother, my father, my sister, and said 6 words that froze the room completely. History repeats only if we allow. For a second, no one spoke. The only sound was Eli's shallow breathing. My mother, Carol, set her wineglass down slowly, her painted lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. "Nora, what on earth are you doing barging in like that? You're dripping water all over my floors." Her voice was calm, practiced the same voice she'd used when scolding me as a child. My father cleared his throat, already annoyed. "Could you at least close the door? You're letting the cold in." I held Eli tighter, his little head pressed against my shoulder. "The cold's already in," I said quietly. My sister Julia shifted uncomfortably at the table, her husband pretending to check his phone. No one moved to help. No one even brought a blanket. The turkey steam filled the air, mixing with the scent of cinnamon and roasted butter, everything I'd ordered and paid for in advance because I'd wanted to make Thanksgiving perfect this year. My mother tilted her head. "He was being disrespectful," she said finally, as if reading from a script. "He needed to learn patience." "He's 9, I shouted. "You left a 9-year-old child outside in 5-degree weather." Her expression didn't change. "And now he knows not to talk back to adults." She said it like she was discussing homework or a broken vase. I felt something inside me shift, something that had been silent for years. The old me, the one who apologized for everything, started to rise, but I forced her back down. I looked around that table, my father always detached and proud, my sister pretending not to see anything that might ruin her comfort, and my mother who could turn cruelty into a moral lesson. I felt my heart pounding against my ribs. "You could have killed him," I whispered. My father sighed. "Let's not ruin the evening with drama." He gestured toward an empty chair, as if I'd sit down and carve myself a slice of peace. The fire crackled behind them, and I noticed how the glow painted their faces gold, soft, almost holy. But under that warmth was something cold and calculating. It was the same cold I'd felt as a child, standing outside that very door waiting for forgiveness that never came. I carried Eli into the living room and set him on the couch, wrapping my coat around him. His skin was clammy, his breathing uneven. "You're okay now," I whispered. "Mommy's here." I turned to my parents. "I'm taking him to the hospital." My mother's eyes narrowed. "For what? He's fine." "You're overreacting again, Nora. Always so dramatic." "Fine," my voice cracked. "Look at him." Julia finally spoke, her tone clipped. "You always find a way to make everything about you." I stared at her, at the way she crossed her arms, the same way she'd done at every holiday, every argument, every time I tried to tell the truth. "This isn't about me," I said. "It's about what's right." My father rose impatient. "Enough. You're upsetting your mother." I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that even surprised me. "I'm upsetting her." She left her grandson outside to freeze. He flinched but didn't respond. That was his pattern, silence as armor. I looked at my mother again. She was wiping the table with a cloth as if cleaning the mess I'd made by existing. "You always mistake kindness for weakness," she said. "That's why people walk all over you." I wanted to scream to break every dish on that perfect table. Instead, I whispered, "And you mistake cruelty for strength." Then I picked up my keys, lifted Eli in my arms, and walked out. Outside, the wind cut through me like glass. I tucked Eli closer, felt the faint pulse under his cold skin, and whispered into his hair. "It ends here." The drive to the hospital blurred. The tires hissed against the ice. My hands clenched the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Eli stirred in the back seat, murmuring something in his sleep. "You're safe," I kept saying. "You're safe now." At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rear-view mirror. Tired eyes, messy hair, a streak of mascara down my cheek. I looked like someone I didn't recognize, someone stronger. When we reached the ER, nurses rushed to take Eli. I followed, numb but alert. The scent of disinfectant hit me like memory. How many nights I'd worked in these halls, saving strangers, believing family was something sacred. Now I knew better. A nurse I knew, Angela, glanced up and gasped. "Nora, what happened, family?" I said, my voice hoarse. "My family happened." As they worked on Eli, I sat in the waiting room, the hum of fluorescent lights above me. The chair was cold, the air colder. But inside me, something had finally ignited a small, fierce flame that refused to go out. I remembered being 7, standing outside that same house one Christmas Eve, because I'd spilled hot chocolate on the rug. My mother had told me 10 minutes in the cold builds character. I'd stood there, teeth chattering, watching snow fall under the porch light. Back then, I thought that was love teaching me lessons through pain. But now, watching my son fight for warmth, I understood it wasn't love. It was legacy, and I was done inheriting it. When the doctor finally came out, he said Eli would be fine. Mild hypothermia. "He's lucky you brought him in when you did." Lucky. That word echoed in my head as I looked out at the falling snow. My parents would call it a misunderstanding, my sister would pretend it never happened, and the world would move on. But I wouldn't. That night, as I sat beside my son's bed and listened to the steady beep of his heart monitor, I made a silent vow. The same vow I'd whispered at the door. The cycle ends with me. No more cold lessons. No more silent endurance. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt awake, and I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever warmth they tried to steal from us, I'd take it back, even if it meant burning every lie to the ground. The morning light in the hospital was the color of steel. It slipped through the blinds in thin gray lines, landing across Eli's face as he slept. His small chest rose and fell beneath the white blanket the same way it used to when he was a baby, and I'd stay awake just to make sure he was breathing. I sat in the chair beside him, hands clasped around a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. The cup trembled slightly, or maybe it was my hands. The doctor said he would recover, that the cold hadn't gone deep enough to cause lasting damage. But I knew better. Cold always leaves something behind. Sometimes it's just invisible. Angela came in halfway through her shift, her scrubs rumpled, a half smile on her face. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said softly. "I haven't," I admitted. She leaned against the doorway. "You okay?" I looked at her, then at Eli. "They called it discipline," I said quietly. Angela's expression changed, her lips pressing together. "Your parents?" I nodded. "They said he needed to learn patience, like I did." Angela hesitated. "Nora, you should document everything. You're a nurse. You know that better than anyone." I almost smiled. I already did. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through photos. Eli on the doorstep, his red hands, the timestamp on the camera footage. I'd sent copies to myself, to my work email, to a hidden cloud folder. Angela nodded in approval. "Good," she said. "Because families like that, they rewrite stories." I looked down at Eli again. They already started. When she left, the room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the heater. I watched the steam rise from the cup and vanish into nothing, and something about that felt like my childhood, warm for a second, gone the next. The phone on my lap buzzed. Unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Miss Emerson, this is Child Protective Services. We'd like to schedule a home visit. My heart stopped. We received a report regarding potential neglect. The voice continued calmly. Your son was reportedly left outside overnight. My throat went dry. That's not true. My parents, ma'am, this is standard procedure. Please be available tomorrow morning. The call ended before I could respond. I stared at the phone, the static echo of their words still vibrating in my ear. For a moment I couldn't move. Then I whispered. They reported me. Eli stirred in his sleep. Mom, I brushed his hair back gently. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. He blinked up at me. Am I in trouble? I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. No, baby. They are. That night I didn't leave his side. The monitor beeped steadily, the rhythm grounding me, reminding me that as long as it kept going, there was still time to fix this. But sleep never came. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw another winter night years ago, Spokane, when I was 8. Snow had fallen for days, covering everything in white silence. I'd spilled milk on the kitchen counter, and my mother told me to stand outside until you learned to be careful. She'd locked the door. I'd stood there in my socks, staring at my reflection in the frosted window. 10 minutes, she said. It felt like hours. When she finally opened the door, she smiled and handed me a towel. See, you survived. That's what makes you strong. I remember thinking strength was just another word for loneliness. Back in the hospital, I rose and washed my face in the sink, the water cold enough to sting. My reflection in the mirror looked different, older, sharper, less afraid. When morning came, Angela brought me fresh scrubs and a large coffee. CPS coming today? She asked quietly. I nodded. They think I neglected him. Of course they do, she muttered. It's what manipulative families do, they strike first. Her words hit me like a truth I'd always known. I'm not losing him, I said. She put a hand on my shoulder. Then fight smart, not loud. By the time I drove home, the sun had risen high enough to melt the frost on the windshield, but inside me the chills stayed. I tidied the living room, arranged Eli's toys, neatly prepared every medical record from the hospital, every timesheet from my 12-hour shift. Evidence. Proof. My armor. When the knock finally came, I already knew the rhythm, firm, official final. 2 CPS workers stood outside with clipboards, one younger woman in glasses, one man in a dark coat. Miss Emerson, we appreciate your cooperation. I nodded. Please come in. They asked questions in practice tones, how often I worked night shifts, where Eli stayed, whether I had family support. I handed over documentation, keeping my voice calm even as my stomach twisted. The younger woman asked, who was caring for your son the night of November 24th? My parents, I said. She scribbled notes. And you trust them? I hesitated. I did. Her eyes lifted, briefly curious. Did they ever discipline you similarly? The question cut deep. I answered truthfully. Yes. She nodded slowly, marking something on her paper. Eli wandered out of his room, clutching his stuffed bear. Mommy, I'm hungry. I smiled gently. I'll make you something soon, honey. The man crouched to Eli's level. Hey there, buddy. Can you tell me what happened at Grandma's house? Eli looked unsure, then whispered. She said I talk too much. The room went silent. When they left, I stood by the window watching their car disappear down the street. My hands were trembling. The silence of the apartment was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to punch through the glass. Instead, I sat down and opened my laptop. There was an email waiting from an unknown sender. Subject line: Emerson Family Trust. Confidential. Attached were PDF files, financial statements, account transfers, documents, signed by my father and mother. I scrolled through line after line until I saw the name at the bottom of the first page, Margaret Emerson. My grandmother. My breath caught. One folder was labeled Winter Blessing Fund, the same fund my father bragged about every Christmas, supposedly their charity project. But now, seeing the amounts transferred between accounts, hundreds of thousands of dollars, I felt my stomach drop. A knock startled me. When I opened the door, a woman stood there, elegant and composed, holding a slim briefcase. "Miss Emerson, yes. My name is Mia Park. I was your grandmother's attorney." Her voice was calm, her eyes clear and kind. "I believe we need to talk about what really happened to her trust." I froze. "How did you?" "Your grandmother left instructions," she said softly, "and I think your parents might have ignored them." For a long moment, the hallway stayed silent, except for the hum of the heater. I stepped aside. "Come in." She entered, setting her briefcase on the table. "You may want to sit down." I didn't. I just crossed my arms, waiting. Mia opened a file, revealing stamped documents and hand-signed letters. "Your grandmother intended this trust for her grandchildren equally. But shortly before she passed, the paperwork was altered. The authorization signature doesn't match hers." I stared at the papers, my heart thudding. "They forged it, it looks that way," Mia said. "And the fund's been drained ever since." I leaned against the counter, my mind spinning. "They've been stealing from her charity," Mia nodded gravely, "and using the church to launder it." I let out a hollow laugh. Of course they did. For years I'd blamed myself for not being enough, for not being the daughter my mother wanted, the sister my father could brag about. But in that moment, something inside me clicked into place. This wasn't just about neglect or cruelty. It was corruption dressed up as faith and family. Mia closed her briefcase. "I can help you, Nora. But you'll have to decide, are you ready to fight?" I looked toward Eli's room, where soft breathing came through the door. My son. The only warmth I had left. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." That night after she left, I sat by the window watching the snow fall over the city. For the first time, the cold didn't paralyze me. It cleared the air. They thought they'd buried me under guilt and silence. But they forgot I'd learned how to survive the cold. And now I was going to use it to expose them all. The text came 2 nights later. "Come for dinner. We need to talk calmly. No apology, no explanation, just another command wrapped in civility." I stared at it for a long minute, thumb hovering above the screen. My instinct said, ignore it, but another part of me, the part that wanted to look them in the eye one last time, said yes. I typed back a single word. "Fine." By 6 that evening, the fog had rolled in thick and low over Seattle. I drove the same road I'd driven 1,000 times as a child, each turn lined with frozen maples and Christmas lights that felt too cheerful for what was coming. In the passenger seat lay my phone, its voice memo app already recording. Angela's words echoed in my head, "Fight smart, not loud." When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had, warm, golden, and deceitful. Laughter leaked from the dining room windows. I sat there for a moment, staring at the glowing house that had taught me to fear my own reflection. Then I stepped out, straightened my coat, and walked to the door. My mother opened it before I could knock, smiling like a hostess greeting a guest she barely liked. "You came," she said lightly, as though nothing had happened. "Of course," I said. "You invited me." Her eyes flicked to my coat. "You're dripping on the porch again." Behind her, the table gleamed crystal glasses, polished silver candles flickering soft gold. My father stood at the head, carving a roast. Julia sat at his left, her hand resting on a wineglass. The whole picture looked staged perfect, ready for another photograph of family unity. "Come sit," my father said, motioning toward an empty chair. "Let's be civilized about this." Civilized. The word almost made me laugh. I hung my coat, keeping my phone running in my pocket, and took a seat. My mother poured me a glass of wine, her movements smooth as choreography. "Let's start by agreeing we all overreacted," she said. Overreacted. My voice came out sharper than I intended. Julia rolled her eyes. "You made such a scene, Nora. People in the neighborhood heard yelling." I stared at her. My son was half frozen. What kind of scene should I have made? A thank you speech. My father cleared his throat, that old signal of authority. Let's not dramatize this. I turned toward him slowly. You call leaving a child outside dramatizing, he sighed. You've always been sensitive. Your mother was trying to teach Eli respect. You, of all people, should understand discipline. I leaned forward. Discipline isn't the same as abuse. My mother's smile didn't move, but her eyes narrowed. You're throwing that word around very carelessly. I took a slow breath. I brought proof. That made them freeze. From my bag, I pulled out my laptop, set it quietly on the table, and pressed play. The screen lit up with the front porch camera feed. Eli, curled up, shivering, knocking softly on the door. My mother's voice echoed from inside. He'll learn faster in the cold. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Julia's hand trembled slightly, her wine glass clinking against the table. This is out of context, she blurted. Context, I repeated. The context is 5 degrees Fahrenheit. My father's face flushed. Where did you get that? From your own camera, I said. The Ring app autosaves to the cloud. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then muttered, That thing's been broken for months. Apparently not. My mother finally spoke. You think playing detective makes you right? I met her gaze. No. The truth makes me right. She pushed her chair back, the legs screeching across the floor. You've always had a flair for drama. Drama. My voice trembled, but not from fear. He could have died. Julia stood abruptly. We're done here. I didn't move. Not yet. I clicked to the next file, an audio clip I'd recorded that same night. My mother's voice again, calm and cold. He's fine. She overreacts. Like always. The sound filled the dining room, echoing against the china cabinet. My father's jaw clenched. Julia muttered something under her breath. When it ended, I closed the laptop and looked at them. You told CPS I neglected him, I said quietly. You made me the villain. My father's tone turned sharp. You're twisting things. I stood. No, I'm finally untwisting them. My mother's eyes glittered. We did what was necessary to protect him from you. The words hit harder than I expected. From me, you work too much, Nora, she snapped. You let strangers raise your son while you chase ambition. We're the ones who've been there for him. I almost laughed. You call that being there? Julia slammed her hand on the table. You're just jealous. Mom and Dad actually trust me. I looked at her, her perfect curls, her diamond bracelet catching the candlelight. Trust you, I said softly. To help them hide their lies. She flinched but quickly masked it with a smirk. You're pathetic, Nora. Always playing the martyr. Better a martyr than a coward, I replied. My father raised his voice for the first time. Enough. The sound cracked like thunder. This family's been through enough embarrassment because of you. I turned toward him slowly. Embarrassment. He took a deep breath, softening his tone. You've been under stress, working long hours. You're imagining things. I laughed bitterly. I'm imagining the footage, the CPS report. The bruises on my child's hands. My mother folded her arms. You'll regret this attitude someday. I straightened. No, I regret letting you shape mine. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the fire seemed to pause, its crackle dying down to a whisper. Julia looked away first. This is pointless. I gathered my bag and laptop, tucking them under my arm. No, I said, my voice low but steady. This is necessary. My father tried one last time, his tone suddenly gentle, practiced. We're still your family, Nora, no matter what you think. I paused at the doorway, glancing back at the table, the glossy plates, the flickering candles, the wine stains spreading like wounds across the linen. Family doesn't make you safe, I said. Family should make you warm. My mother's voice followed me out. You're making a mistake. I turned, meeting her eyes for the last time that night. Maybe. But at least it'll be mine. The door closed behind me, sealing in the silence. Outside, the night air bit through my coat, but it felt cleaner, somehow purer. I walked to my car, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the wind brushing cold against my face. In the reflection of the car window, my eyes looked calm, not broken, not furious, just awake. I started the engine and glanced once more at the house. Through the window I could see them moving again, rearranging plates, fixing their masks. Pretending nothing had happened. They'd trained me well in pretending. But they didn't know that silence once broken never returns to what it was. As I pulled away, the headlights cut through the fog. My phone vibrated with a message from Angela. "Are you okay?" I typed back, "No. But I will be." The road ahead glistened under the frost, and for the first time in years I didn't feel afraid of the dark. That night I didn't just walk away from a dinner table. I walked away from a lifetime of being told to stay quiet. And for the first time, the cold didn't scare me, it steadied me, because now I knew what warmth I was fighting for. The knock came just after sunrise. 3 quick, sharp raps on the door, authoritative, practiced, final. I froze mid-step, still holding my coffee. For a moment I thought it was my parents again, ready for another round of polite cruelty. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw 2 figures. Instead, one woman with a clipboard, another man in a navy jacket with a police badge clipped to his belt. "Nora Emerson?" the woman asked when I opened the door. "Yes. I'm Karen Lewis with Child Protective Services. This is Officer Daniels with Seattle PD. We need to speak with you about your son." The words hit like a punch. "About Eli, it's just routine," she said, voice neutral. "Can we come in?" I stepped aside automatically, my heart beat loud in my ears. They entered, their presence filling the small apartment like a cold wind. Karen began flipping through her folder. "We received an additional report of neglect and emotional instability from a family member. We'll need to do a quick evaluation." My voice came out tight. "A family member, I'm not authorized to name them," she replied, though we both knew exactly who. Eli wandered sleepily from his room, rubbing his eyes. "Mommy, who are they?" I forced a smile. "Just some people asking questions, sweetheart. Go back to your room for now, okay?" He nodded, hesitant, before disappearing down the hall. Karen sat across from me, the officer standing silent near the window. "Can you tell us what happened on Thanksgiving night? I was working a 12-hour shift. Eli was staying with my parents. When I came home, I found him outside, barefoot, freezing." Karen's pen scratched across her clipboard. "And you believe your parents locked him out intentionally?" "I don't believe I said." "I know. I have footage." Her eyes flicked up. "You recorded your parents. I saved my son." The room went still for a moment. Then she continued, "Have there been other incidents of overreaction on your part? Any history of stress at work, difficulty managing hours?" I could feel the blood draining from my face. "Are you asking if being a nurse makes me unfit to be a mother?" Karen didn't blink. "I'm asking how often you're away from home." I handed her my timesheets from the hospital, neatly printed and highlighted. "Every shift is documented. Every hour accounted for. You can verify with HR." She took the papers but said nothing. The officer looked at me with polite detachment, as if I were already a case number instead of a person. Then Karen asked softly, "Who supports you emotionally, miss?" "Emerson." The question caught me off guard. I almost said my family out of habit. Instead, I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No one." She nodded as if confirming something to herself. "All right. We'll need to schedule a follow-up. And for now, Eli will stay with a relative until the review is complete." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what? It's temporary, just a precaution. It's standard in cases of disputed care." My stomach dropped. "You're not taking my son." "It's for his safety," she said, gently, rehearsed. "He's safe with me." The officer stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, please." Karen avoided my eyes. "Your parents have agreed to keep him until the process is done." The air seemed to vanish from the room. I could barely stand. "You're giving him back to the people who did this. I understand this is difficult," she said softly. "But this is protocol." Eli came back into the room, then clutching his stuffed bear. "Mom, why are you crying?" I knelt and took his hands. You're going to stay with Grandma for a few days. Okay. His eyes widened with panic. No, Mom, please. I hugged him tight, breathing in the scent of his hair, trying to memorize it. It's just for a little while, I whispered. I'll fix this. When they left, the apartment felt too big, too quiet. The door clicked shut, and I sank to the floor, my body shaking. The same cold that once lived in my parents' house had followed me here. I don't know how long I sat there before my phone buzzed. A text from Angela Heard from CPS. You, okay, I typed back. They took him. Her reply came fast. Then, we fight back. You're not alone. I stared at those words for a long time. You're not alone. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe I just had to find new allies. That afternoon I went to work pretending to be fine. The sterile light of the hospital seemed harsher than usual. I washed my hands 3 times before realizing I hadn't even touched a patient yet. Every beep, every alarm, every faint cry from the ER twisted inside me. Angela found me in the supply room. You shouldn't be here. I can't sit at home, I said. Not while they think they've won. She lowered her voice. You need to be smart, Nora. Get legal help. I told her about the woman who had come by the lawyer Mia Park and the envelope she'd left. Angela frowned. You think that's connected? I don't know yet, I said. But she mentioned my grandmother's trust. And the same day my parents report me to CPS, she shows up with proof they've been stealing. That's not coincidence. Angela studied me, then nodded. So what's the plan? I exhaled slowly. I'm going to find out everything they've taken from my grandmother, from Eli, from me. When my shift ended, I drove home, exhaustion pressing heavy on my chest. The apartment was still the silence, sharp as glass. On the kitchen table lay the envelope Mia had given me, untouched since that morning. I opened it again, reading through the numbers, the signatures, the name Winter Blessing Fund. One document stopped me cold. A donation transfer dated 3 months after my grandmother's death. Signed in her name. My grandmother, who had been bedridden and barely able to hold a pen. I grabbed my phone and called Mia. She answered on the first ring. I read the documents, I said. They forged her signature. Mia's voice was calm but urgent. That's what I suspected. They used the church's charity as a front. There's more. Meet me tomorrow at my office, 10 a.m. I rubbed my forehead, trying to steady my breathing. Mia, they took my son today. A pause. Then her tone softened. Then we don't just get justice for your grandmother, we get him back. For the first time all day I let myself breathe. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. The city lights glowed faint through the windows streaked with drizzle. Somewhere out there, Eli was probably curled up in the same guest room where I'd spent countless nights as a child, listening to my parents whisper about my attitude. I reached for his favorite book on the shelf, the one we read every night. My voice cracked as I opened it. Once there was a boy, I read aloud to the empty room, who thought the world was too cold until he built a fire all his own. The words blurred through my tears. They could take my child. They could twist the system. But they had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. I was my mother's daughter, but without her cruelty. I was my father's blood, but without his deceit. And now I was something they'd never expected, prepared. By the time I turned off the light, I already knew what I had to do. Tomorrow I would walk into Mia Park's office. And by the time this was over, the Emersons wouldn't just lose their money. They'd lose the empire they built on everyone else's silence. The next morning, the city was drenched in a thin gray rain that smelled like iron and smoke. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eli's face pressed against the car window as they drove him away. By 8, I was already downtown, clutching the envelope Mia Park had given me. Her office was on the top floor of an old red brick building that used to be a bank, the kind of place where truth didn't come cheap. Mia was waiting by the window when I arrived. She was in her 60s, small and sharp, her dark hair streaked with silver, her movements precise, like someone who'd spent her life in courtrooms. "You're early," she said, not looking up from the papers on her desk. "I didn't sleep." "Good," she replied. Neither did I. She gestured toward a chair. Sit. We have work to do. I sat down. She pushed a stack of documents toward me, copies of old bank statements, notarized letters, legal transfers. At the top of the pile was my grandmother's name, Margaret Emerson Family Trust. That trust, Mia said, was supposed to divide your grandmother's estate equally between you and your sister. 2 accounts, 2 beneficiaries. She slid a paper closer. But 6 months before she died, an amendment was filed redirecting all assets to your parents under something called the Winter Blessing Fund. I leaned in, scanning the text. My grandmother never mentioned this. She couldn't have, Mia said, because she didn't sign it. I looked up sharply. You're sure? Mia nodded. I handled her affairs until your father forced me out. He claimed she wanted simpler management. But I know her handwriting. This is forgery. I stared at the looping signature, familiar and wrong at the same time. They used her name to steal her money. Mia folded her hands. And they used the church to wash it. The Winter Blessing Fund operates as a charitable foundation under St. Matthew's Church. Donations come in and they disappear into shell companies. One of them belongs to your sister Julia. My breath caught. Julia. She's involved. Mia raised an eyebrow. She's listed as treasurer of a business called Gracewell Supplies. The fund purchases materials from it every quarter. I leaned back, trying to process it. So this isn't just family greed, it's organized fraud. It's worse, Mia said. It's sanctified fraud. People donated to help the poor and your parents used that money to buy property and investment shares. I can trace at least 3 transfers directly into their accounts. I rubbed my temples. My grandmother would have been horrified. Mia looked out the window, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. She tried to stop it. She called me the week before she went into the hospital, said she felt unsafe, said she thought someone was altering her medication. I froze. What are you saying? Mia met my eyes. I'm saying her death may not have been natural. The room tilted slightly, like the air itself had shifted. You think they killed her? I think she knew too much. I stood up, pacing to the window. The rain had turned to sleet, tapping the glass like restless fingers. They covered it up with paperwork, with sermons and donations. Nobody would ever question them. Mia's voice softened. Until now. I turned back. Why help me? You could have walked away years ago. She smiled faintly. Your grandmother believed truth doesn't need to shout it, just needs someone brave enough to speak it. She thought that person might be you. For a long moment I couldn't speak. I sat down again, staring at the folder. Where do we start? Mia pushed another file toward me. With this, inside was a list of transactions from the church's bank account. The dates matched the months after my grandmother's death. Each transfer labeled Winter Blessing Fund Disbursement. Amounts ranging from $10,000 to $50,000. I traced one line with my finger. This one went to St. Matthew's maintenance. That's normal, right? Except Mia said, pulling another paper from the pile, the same amount was deposited the next day into Gracewell Supplies. I stared at the evidence. The line between charity and theft blurred into one continuous stroke. We can prove this with the originals, Mia said. But they're in the church's private archive. You'd need access. I thought for a moment, then nodded. My father still trusts me enough to believe I'll back down. Maybe he'd let me in. Mia gave a small, approving smile. Then let's make him think that. I left her office with a flash drive of copied documents and the uneasy weight of new knowledge pressing on my chest. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like something waiting to break. On the way home, I stopped by my grandmother's old house. It was boarded up, now owned by the bank after my parents liquidated the trust. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. I found the spare key still hidden under the flower pot, just where she used to keep it. The inside smelled of dust and lavender. I wandered from room to room, each one smaller than I remembered. In her bedroom, the curtains were still drawn. On the dresser sat her silver brush, set a half-burned candle, and a small wooden box with her initials M.E. carved into it. I opened it carefully. Inside were brittle letters and a small leather-bound notebook. The first page stopped me cold. Richard insists on handling the fund. I fear what he's becoming. If anything happens, tell Nora to look for the papers. I pressed my fingers to the words, the ink faded but still legible. My throat tightened. "I'm here, Grandma," I whispered. "I've found them." I spent the next hour photographing every page, every entry. There were notes about meetings with the pastor, names of donors, even hand-drawn diagrams of account transfers. At the very end, one final sentence in shaky handwriting: "Truth survives the cold." By the time I locked the house again, the sun was setting behind thick gray clouds. That night I met Mia at a diner near the courthouse. She ordered tea. I stuck with coffee. I handed her the photos and she scrolled through them silently. "This confirms everything she said at last. And more. Your grandmother wasn't just suspicious, she was documenting the fraud in real time." "What happens next?" I asked. "We take this to the state attorney's office," she said. "But first we need to make sure the church's financial records don't disappear. That means getting copies before they realize what you have." I nodded slowly. "Then I'll go there this Sunday." Mia looked at me over her cup. "That won't be easy. Your father's still a board member." "All the better," I said quietly. "He'll never expect me to walk into his sanctuary." As we stood to leave, Mia placed a hand on my arm. "This will get dangerous, Nora. People hide behind religion because it's the best mask there is. Once you tear it off, they don't forgive." I managed a tired smile. Neither do I. Driving home, I passed the glowing steeple of St. Matthew's Church. The bell rang 8 times, echoing over the rooftops like a warning. I rolled down the window, letting the cold air hit my face. For the first time in weeks, it didn't sting, it cleared my head. They thought they buried the truth under hymns and sermons, under scripture and gold crosses. But my grandmother was right. Truth survives the cold. And I was done surviving. I was ready to make it burn. Sunday morning came dressed in sunlight and deception. The church bells rang across the foggy Seattle air, their sound pure enough to make anyone believe goodness still lived here. I parked across the street from St. Matthew's, watching as families filed in, women in wool coats, children holding paper angels, men shaking hands like trust was automatic. Somewhere inside that stone building, my father was smiling and my mother was pretending grace was her second language. I adjusted the scarf around my neck and crossed the street. My palms were damp, but my face was calm. I'd been walking into hostel rooms since I was a child. This one just had stained glass. The ushers greeted me at the door like I was the prodigal daughter returning home. "Nora, so lovely to see you," one woman whispered, her perfume sickly sweet. "Your father will be thrilled." I smiled politely. "I bet he will." Inside, sunlight spilled through the colored glass, painting the pews in red and gold. The choir began to sing, "Amazing Grace." My father stood at the pulpit, his voice strong and warm as he spoke about charity, family, and God's mercy. "Kindness," he said, "keeps families warm even in the coldest winters." The congregation nodded, moved. I sat near the back, my hands clenched. That word warm felt like mockery coming from his mouth. I thought of Eli's purple lips, his tiny voice saying Grandma told him to learn. I felt my stomach twist. When the sermon ended, the applause was polite but full of admiration. My father stepped down, shaking hands, his eyes scanning the crowd. They stopped when they found me. For just a flicker of a second, his smile faltered. Then it returned, brighter, too polished. "Sweetheart," he said when he reached me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I didn't expect you." "Clearly," I replied. "But I needed to see where all that warmth comes from." He chuckled softly, the kind of sound that could fool the deaf. "Let's not start that here. Your mother's in the fellowship hall. We're having a little brunch after service. Come along." I followed him down the hall, lined with plaques and framed verses. My mother waited inside arranging pastries on a table labeled Winter Blessing Fund, helping families in need. The irony nearly made me laugh. She turned smile painted on like lacquer. Nora. What a surprise. Surprises seem to run in this family, I said, scanning the banner behind her. It showed photos of happy children in coats. I wondered how many of those coats actually existed. My mother gestured toward a middle-aged woman behind the table. This is Mrs. Darnell, our volunteer coordinator. Mrs. Darnell's eyes lit up. Your parents' program is our pride. We've helped so many families. I tilted my head. That's wonderful. And where exactly does the money go? She blinked, caught off guard. Well, Pastor Morrison manages the disbursement. My father jumped in smoothly. We work closely with him. Transparency is very important to us. I smiled faintly. I'm sure it is. While they turned to greet another guest, I slipped a folded paper from my bag, a small flash drive taped to the inside. Angela had given it to me the night before, filled with copied files from the church website's hidden directory. All I needed now were the originals to match. A hand touched my elbow. Nora, it was Mia. She stood at the back of the hall, wearing a modest gray coat and dark glasses. She looked like any other parishioner. I thought you might need backup, she murmured. You read my mind. We moved toward the side door that led to the administrative offices. A deacon passing by smiled at us, assuming we were volunteers. Once he disappeared, Mia pulled out a set of old brass keys. One benefit of handling their paperwork years ago, she whispered. The office smelled like dust and old candles. Folders stacked on every surface, the kind of chaos that pretends to be order. Mia went straight to a locked cabinet. Keep an eye out, she said. I nodded, heart pounding. She worked quickly, her hands sure. A soft click and the drawer slid open. Inside were binders labeled donor records and fund reports. She grabbed one and flipped through. Each page was stamped and signed by my father and Pastor Morrison. She handed me a copy. Gracewell Supplies, she said. Julia's company. I looked closer. The same shell business that had received transfers from the charity. They really didn't even bother hiding it. They never do, Mia said. When people believe they're untouchable, they stop cleaning their fingerprints. Voices echoed faintly in the hallway, my father's and Pastor Morrison's. We froze. I'm telling you. Morrison's voice hissed. She's getting suspicious, showing up unannounced, asking questions. My father's tone was low, sharp. She's angry. She'll burn herself out. She always does. She's not a child anymore, Richard. A pause then. My father's voice quiet but deadly. Then she'll learn the hard way what happens when you cross family. I met Mia's eyes. We didn't move until their footsteps faded. Mia exhaled. We have enough to prove misappropriation. Not yet, I said. I want Morrison's signature on a current document. She gave a small smile. You're your grandmother's granddaughter. We left the office, walking calmly back through the hallway. When we reached the main hall, my mother intercepted us. Leaving already, she asked, her tone honeyed. Just getting some air, I said. She tilted her head. You know, Nora, forgiveness is powerful. You can't live your life trying to expose everyone's mistakes. Forgiveness, I said softly, only works when someone admits they're wrong. She sighed dramatically, as if I were the one embarrassing her. You've always been so emotional. It's exhausting. I smiled thinly. Maybe that's why people remember me and forget you. Her face hardened, but before she could speak, a volunteer approached with a clipboard. Mrs. Emerson, Pastor Morrison needs you in the office to sign the new fund forms. The timing was perfect. I followed a few steps behind as she disappeared with the woman, then slipped into the pew area where the forms were kept. Through the half-open door, I could see Morrison hunched over a desk, handing her papers. Just sign here, Carol, he said. And we'll have the transfer ready by tomorrow. My mother's pen hovered over the line. Morrison's voice dropped. Your husband said to keep this quiet. We can't risk another audit. That was all I needed. I tapped my phone screen twice, recording everything. When she finished signing, they left together, their laughter echoing down the hall. I stepped inside, snapped a photo of the document, and took a second copy for Mia's records. The letterhead read Winter Blessing Fund, transfer to Gracewell Supplies, authorized by R. Emerson and C. Emerson. Proof, real, physical, undeniable. Outside, the bells began to ring again, calling the next service to worship. I stood there for a long time, staring at the altar through the glass door. The gold cross gleamed under the morning light. It used to mean safety to me. Now it looked like a shield for sinners. Mia joined me quietly. "You got it," I nodded, holding up the papers. "Then we're done here," she said. "Not yet," I murmured, looking back toward the sanctuary. "They've been preaching warmth while freezing everyone around them. It's time they feel what cold really is." We walked out together, the sound of hymns following us like ghosts. By the time I reached my car, I already knew what came next. The Winter Gala, the perfect stage. They'd built their empire on stolen warmth, and now I would burn it down with truth. The package was waiting on my doorstep when I got home that night. No return address, just my name, written in neat block letters across the front. For a second, I thought it might be another legal notice from CPS, another reminder of everything they'd taken. But when I picked it up, it was too light, too personal. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a full minute before opening it. Inside was a thin envelope yellowed at the edges. On the front, in shaky handwriting, were 5 words. From someone who loved her. My heart stuttered. I tore it open. Out slid a birth certificate. Julia Emerson. Place of birth, Seattle. Mother unknown. Father Richard Emerson. I froze. Beneath it was a single page from a DNA report dated almost 10 years ago. The test compared Julia Emerson to Carol Emerson. Result: no biological relation. The room tilted. For a long time I could only stare at the papers, my fingers trembling. Julia wasn't my mother's daughter. My sister, my enemy, wasn't even fully blood. I sank into the chair, the sound of my own breathing suddenly loud. All the memories began rearranging themselves in my mind, the way my mother had always favored Julia, the gifts, the gentle tone she never used, with me the constant comparisons. I thought it was cruelty. Maybe it was guilt. The phone rang sharp and intrusive. I grabbed it. "Mia, I just got the same documents," she said. "They were couriered to my office." "So it's true." "Yes, and that's not all." Her tone darkened. "There's a record of a woman named Linda Hayes, a church accountant who worked under your father in the 90s. She disappeared not long after Julia was born." I gripped the table edge. I think your father had an affair, Nora. And when your grandmother found out she planned to expose him, that's when everything changed." For a moment, the silence between us was unbearable. Then I whispered, "He destroyed her to protect his image," Mia exhaled. "And used your mother to cover the shame, which means everyone in that house was living a lie." The line went quiet again. Then she added, "I can't prove what happened to Linda Hayes yet, but I found something else. You'll want to see it in person." I met her the next morning at her office. The rain hadn't stopped all night. The sky hung low and colorless. Mia had a manila folder waiting on her desk. She opened it without a word. "These are the original medical reports from the hospital where your grandmother died," she said. "I had a contact pull them. Look at the toxicology section." I scanned the lines, my pulse climbing. There it was: trace amounts of arsenic detected. My mouth went dry. "Arsenic too small to trigger suspicion at the time," Mia said. "But given the context, it's telling." I pressed my hands to my face. "He killed her." Mia didn't answer. When I looked up again, she was watching me quietly. "This is bigger than family now, Nora. It's murder and fraud tied to a religious institution." "Are you ready for that?" I nodded, even though my voice was gone. That night, I drove past my parents' house. Lights glowed behind the curtains just like always. From the street, it looked peaceful, normal. But now I could see it for what it was: a stage built on bodies and lies. Julia's car was parked in the driveway. I stopped at the curb, engine still running. She came out onto the porch a few minutes later, wrapped in a red coat, smoking. When she spotted me, she froze. Then she smiled, that same smug half-smile she'd perfected since childhood. I rolled down the window. "We need to talk." She hesitated, then came down the steps, heels clicking against the concrete. "If this is about Thanksgiving again," I held up the envelope. "It's about this." She stopped mid-step. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter." I got out of the car, closing the door behind me. "You're not Mom's daughter." Her face drained of color. "Who told you doesn't matter?" I said again. "But I know about Linda Hayes." Julia looked away, the cigarette trembling between her fingers. "So what, you think that changes anything? It changes everything." She let out a bitter laugh. "Please. You think I didn't know? I've known my whole life." The words hit harder than I expected. "You knew?" "Of course," she said. "Dad told me when I was 13. Said Mom couldn't handle it. Said I needed to protect the family image, so I kept quiet." She looked at me then, eyes sharp. "I learned early truth only destroys people." "That's exactly what he taught you to believe," I said. "And it's killing you, too." She flicked the cigarette into the snow. "You think you're better than me because you play savior. You're just like them, Nora. You want control. That's why you're doing this." "No," I said softly. "I'm doing this because someone has to stop them." Julia stepped closer, her perfume mixed with smoke and frost. "You don't get it. You'll burn everything down, including yourself." I looked her straight in the eye. "Then let it burn." She flinched for just a second before turning back toward the house. "You'll regret this," maybe I said, walking back to the car. "But at least I'll finally regret something honest." As I drove away, the snow started falling harder, blurring the rearview mirror until her figure disappeared completely. When I got home, I sat on the couch for a long time staring at the wall. The old family photos still hung there, smiles that no longer meant anything. I took them down one by one, stacking them on the floor. Behind each frame was a faint square of cleaner paint, as if the truth had been hiding there all along. I pulled out my grandmother's notebook from the drawer and opened it to the last page. The handwriting was weaker there, uneven but determined. "Blood means nothing without love." I traced the words with my fingertip, then whispered, "You were right." My phone buzzed. Mia again. "I spoke with a contact at the Attorney General's office," she said. "They're reviewing the files. But if we want real pressure, we need the public involved. The Winter Gala is next week. Your parents will both be there." I closed the notebook slowly. "Then that's where it ends." When I hung up, I went into Eli's room. His drawings still covered the walls. Crayon sun-stick figures holding hands, a big yellow house labeled home. I sat on his bed, picking up one of his stuffed animals, and whispered, "We're almost done, baby. I promise." Outside, the wind howled through the gaps in the window frame. I thought of my father's sermons, my mother's smile, Julia's bitterness. Every word, every act of cruelty, they'd all been different shades of the same cold, and I had finally learned how to fight it, not by matching their darkness, but by dragging it into the light. As I turned off the lamp, I caught my reflection in the glass. For the first time, I didn't see the scared daughter or the dutiful sister. I saw the woman my grandmother must have hoped I'd become. The one ready to end the Emerson name's legacy of cold once and for all. The call came just before dawn. I was standing by the window watching the first light crawl across the wet rooftops when my phone buzzed. Unknown number again. For a heartbeat, I thought it might be Mia with another update. But when I answered, the voice was young, nervous. "Miss Emerson, this is Dr. Patel from Street Helena Children's Hospital. Your son's been admitted." I gripped the windowsill. "What? Why? What happened?" "He's stable now," she said carefully. "He collapsed during morning recess at your parents' residence. Severe fever, dehydration, and signs of cold stress. You should come immediately." Cold stress. The words sliced through me like glass. I didn't even hang up properly. I just grabbed my coat and keys and ran. By the time I reached the hospital, the world outside was still gray, still half asleep. The automatic doors hissed open, and I was hit by that familiar mix of antiseptic and coffee. I'd walked these halls 100 times as a nurse, but now every step felt like walking through water. Eli was in room 204. When I pushed the door open, my knees almost gave out. He lay there small and pale against the sheets, an IV running into his arm. His skin had that waxy look that only comes from too much cold and too much fear. I went to him and pressed my forehead to his hand. It was warm now, barely, but still trembling. "Hey, sweetheart," I whispered. "Mom's here." His eyelids fluttered. "Mom, I'm right here, baby." He blinked slowly. Grandma said. I had to learn again. My throat closed. No, you don't. You don't ever have to learn like that again." The door opened behind me. Dr. Patel entered quietly, clipboard in hand. "He's lucky you came so quickly," she said. His temperature was dangerously low. "There are signs of older frost damage on his feet and hands." Has this ever happened? Before I stared at her, unable to answer. Because it had. Because the night they took him, I'd noticed faint white scars across his toes, and I'd convinced myself they were nothing. Dr. Patel's voice softened. "He'll recover. Physically. But you may want to consider therapy. Exposure trauma at this age can leave deep marks." I nodded, but my hands were shaking. After she left, I sat back in the chair and listened to the heart monitor beep in its steady rhythm. Each sound felt like a small promise that I hadn't lost him. Not yet. Angela arrived a few hours later with coffee and a bag of breakfast sandwiches I couldn't touch. She stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, then quietly set the food down. "They did it again, didn't they?" I didn't answer. She moved closer, her expression hardening. "You can't let them near him again, Nora. Not after this." "I won't," I said. My voice was low but steady. "This ends now." Angela sat across from me, elbows on her knees. "You're sure you're ready for what comes next? They'll deny it. They'll twist it. They already have," I cut in. "They've twisted everything since I was a child. But this time I have proof, and I have nothing left to lose." For a long time she didn't say anything. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then, let's make sure you win." After she left, I pulled up my email and opened the folder Mia had shared with me. Copies of financial records, church transfers, and now the audio I'd recorded of my parents signing fraudulent documents. It was all there. Enough to take everything from them. But as I sat there, watching Eli's small chest rise and fall, the anger began to shift. It wasn't the white-hot rage I'd carried for weeks. It was something heavier, sadder. I realized what terrified me most wasn't that my parents had hurt him. It was that they'd taught me in their own way how to hurt myself, through silence, through obedience, through pretending things were fine. A nurse came in to check Eli's vitals. I watched her gently adjust his blanket the same way I used to when he was a baby. When she left, I whispered, "You're never going back there." Later that evening, my mother arrived. She wore a beige coat, pearls around her neck, and a face painted in the same calm she always used to hide behind. "Nora," she said softly, as though we were two old friends meeting after a misunderstanding. "I came as soon as I heard. I didn't get up. You shouldn't be here." Her eyes darted to Eli, then back to me. "I only wanted to see him. He doesn't need you." "You can't mean that," she whispered. "You know I love him." I laughed, a low, hollow sound. "You left him outside. Twice." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't look real. "You don't understand, Nora. I was only trying to teach him discipline. The world isn't kind." I stood up. "No, Mom. You were trying to make him survive the world you created. The cold, the silence, the shame. But he doesn't belong in that world. Neither do I." Her hands shook. "You sound just like your grandmother." "Good." For a long moment she didn't move. Then she reached for my hand, but I stepped back. Her fingers hovered in the air, trembling slightly before falling to her side. I didn't know how to love differently, she said finally. I thought strength meant distance. I swallowed hard. Then learn what it means to be weak. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then turned toward the door. Before she left, she whispered, I'm sorry, Nora. The words hung in the air, fragile and late. That night, after she was gone, I sat beside Eli's bed and watched the snow fall through the narrow hospital window. The flakes drifted slow, silent, and perfect. I reached out, pressing my hand against the cold glass, and whispered to myself, it ends with me. At midnight, Eli stirred again. Mom, yes, baby. Are we going home soon? I smiled. Soon, but not to Grandma's. To our home. He nodded, half asleep. Can we have the fireplace on every night? He smiled faintly and drifted back into dreams. When the nurse came to turn off the lights, I asked her to leave one lamp on. He's afraid of the dark, I said. She smiled gently. A lot of kids are. But Eli wasn't afraid of the dark. He was afraid of the cold. As the hours passed, I thought of my grandmother again, how she'd written, truth survives the cold. Maybe warmth does too, if you protect it hard enough. I took out my notebook and began to write line after line, not for Mia or the lawyers or the police, but for myself. For Eli. For every silent child left outside in the snow. When I finished, the first light of morning was sliding through the blinds. Eli's breathing was even again. I closed the notebook, feeling something inside me shift, not anger this time, but clarity. Revenge had always been my fuel, but it wasn't the destination. The destination was safety. For him, for me, for anyone who'd ever been told cold builds character. I kissed Eli's forehead and whispered, no more cold lessons. Ever. Then I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the gray horizon. Somewhere out there, my father was preparing for his precious winter gala, the night he'd call himself a man of faith before hundreds of donors. He wanted warmth. I was going to give it to him. Only this time it would come as fire. The invitation arrived 2 days after Eli was discharged. Heavy cream paper gold lettering the Emerson family crest, embossed in the corner as if nothing had changed. You are cordially invited to the annual Winter Blessing Fund Gala. Hosted by Richard and Carol Emerson. The words made my skin crawl. It was the same charity they'd built on lies, the same event my grandmother used to attend with pride. This year, it would host their downfall. Mia called as soon as I texted her a photo. Perfect, she said. Everyone who matters will be there. Politicians, donors, the press. If you're ready, this is our stage. I'm ready, I said. The night of the gala, the sky hung low with snow clouds, the kind that threaten but never deliver. I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the black satin of my dress. It wasn't glamorous. It was armor. My hair was pulled back, my lips painted dark red. When I looked at myself, I didn't see the daughter they'd taught to apologize. I saw the woman who was about to end them. Angela picked me up outside my apartment. You sure you don't want me to drive you straight into Canada? After this, she joked softly. Not yet, I said, slipping the flash drive into my clutch. There's one more thing I have to do. The event was held at the Fairmont Grand, a hotel my father once bragged about donating to during renovations. The lobby glittered with chandeliers and gold garland. Men in tuxedos, women in sequined gowns, laughter bubbling over champagne. The air smelled like expensive perfume and denial. I walked in like I belonged there. My mother spotted me first. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Nora, she said, approaching with open arms. I didn't think you'd come. I wouldn't miss it, I said. My father stood a few feet away, shaking hands with the city councilman. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, always scanning the room for advantage. When he saw me, he hesitated, then forced a genial grin. Well, he said, if it isn't my prodigal daughter? Funny, I said. I was just thinking the same about you. He chuckled, clapping my shoulder. Let's keep tonight pleasant, shall we? It's for charity, after all. Of course, I said, smiling tightly. For charity. Behind me, Mia moved through the crowd with quiet precision. She wore a dark green dress blending in perfectly among the donors. I saw her glance toward the stage where a large screen displayed a slideshow of donation highlights and church partnerships. She met my eyes across the room and nodded once. Everything was ready. My father took the stage just as the orchestra faded. The crowd applauded. "Good evening, everyone," he began, voice smooth and warm. "Thank you for joining us in another year of blessings. The Winter Fund continues to bring warmth and hope to hundreds of families across Washington. Because of your generosity, we've been able to." I stopped listening. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the rest. My fingers brushed the small USB drive in my purse, the one with the church documents, the bank transfers, and the recording of him threatening Pastor Morrison. When he said the words warmth and faith, I walked toward the back of the room where Angela and the tech team waited. She'd convinced a sympathetic worker to let us connect to the projector feed for a tribute video. "You ready?" Angela whispered. I nodded. "Let's begin." The first images on the screen were exactly what everyone expected: photos of children in winter coats, volunteers handing out food. My father smiled proudly from the stage. Then slowly the images shifted. A spreadsheet appeared. Winter Blessing Fund account transfers. Amounts $10,000, $25,000, $50,000, each labeled with Gracewell Supplies. Then came the signature lines authorized by Richard Emerson and Carol Emerson. The murmurs began immediately. My father's smile froze. The next slide showed the video from the church office, the one where my mother signed documents while Pastor Morrison whispered, "We can't risk another audit." A gasp rippled through the crowd. My mother stood near the champagne table, her hand tightening around her glass until it cracked. The microphone on stage screeched as my father grabbed it. "There must be some mistake," he said. "These are private documents illegally obtained," but the screen didn't stop. Now it played the audio from that hallway, the one Mia and I recorded. My father's voice cold and clear. "Then she'll learn the hard way what happens when you cross family." The room went silent. Every eye turned toward me. I stepped forward, heart steady. "That's what he said about me," I told them. After locking my son outside in 5-degree weather. After stealing from his own mother's charity. After using God as a mask for greed. The city councilman looked horrified. Reporters were already raising their phones. My father's face turned red. "Enough," he shouted. "This is slander." I walked closer to the stage. "No, Dad. This is truth. The one thing you taught me to fear." He stepped toward me, microphone still in hand, his voice dropping low. "You think you've won?" "No," I said. "I think the truth has." Behind me, Mia motioned to security and a pair of uniformed officers who'd been waiting outside the ballroom. She'd called them earlier, providing evidence of financial fraud and falsified trust documents. The officers approached the stage. My father's voice cracked with fury. "You can't do this. I built this." One of the officers said calmly, "Richard Emerson, you're under arrest for fraud and embezzlement." The audience exploded in whispers and flashes from cameras. My mother tried to follow him, screaming that it was all a mistake, but another officer stepped forward to escort her aside. For a long moment, I just stood there frozen. Then someone started clapping. A single slow clap from the back, Angela. Others joined in, uncertain at first, then louder. It wasn't applause for spectacle. It was for truth. I turned to the microphone. "For years," I said quietly, "I believed love meant staying silent. Tonight I learned love means speaking. It means protecting the innocent. My grandmother's charity wasn't built for greed, it was built for warmth. And that's exactly what I intend to return to it." The crowd erupted again. Some people clapped, others cried. A few just stared at me, their faces pale with shock. But I didn't care. For the first time, I wasn't performing. Mia came up beside me, touching my shoulder. "It's done," she said softly. I looked out over the glittering room, the chandeliers reflecting off the tears and disbelief of people who'd thought they knew my family. "No," I said. "It's just beginning." Outside, the snow had finally started to fall. As I stepped out into the cold, the sound of police sirens faded into the distance. The air bit against my skin, but I didn't shiver. This time the cold didn't hurt. It cleansed. The next morning the world already knew. Every local channel, every news site, every talk show was saying the same thing: the Emerson scandal. Photos of my father being led out of the ballroom in handcuffs looped on repeat. My mother's face, frozen in disbelief, stared back at me from the front page of the Seattle Chronicle. Charity fraud exposed: Emerson family accused of embezzlement and forgery. I turned off the TV and just sat there, the silence heavy. The apartment felt too clean, too still. On the counter, Eli's breakfast sat untouched: half a bowl of cereal, a glass of milk that was beginning to sweat. He was still asleep, curled up in my bed where he'd wandered sometime after midnight. For once, I didn't move to wake him. I wanted him to sleep through at least one peaceful morning. My phone buzzed endlessly. Messages from reporters, co-workers, distant relatives, suddenly remembering my number. Some offered sympathy, others wanted a quote. I deleted them all. But when I saw Mia's name flash across the screen, I answered. They're charging your father with fraud, falsification of charitable documents, and tax evasion, she said. Federal case. It's moving fast. What about my mother? She's listed as a co-conspirator, Mia replied. She signed several of the transfer papers, but if she cooperates, she might get leniency. I leaned back against the counter, exhaling. So, it's really over. It's over for them, Mia said gently. Now it's your turn to decide what comes next. After we hung up, I went to the window. The street outside was blanketed in pale snow, quiet and deceptively calm. I thought about all the years my father had used that same calm to cover his lies, his voice smooth, his smile measured. It was strange seeing justice look so ordinary. A knock startled me. When I opened the door, 2 reporters stood there, microphones ready. Miss Emerson, can we get a comment? One asked breathlessly. How does it feel to expose your own family? I stared at them for a second. Then I said evenly, it feels like breathing again. And I shut the door. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. Emails from the hospital approving my return next week, texts from Angela, checking in, a call from Mia's assistant, saying the Attorney General's office wanted to schedule a statement. I moved through it all like a ghost. Every time I caught my reflection, I barely recognized the woman staring back. By afternoon, the doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't reporters. It was a uniformed officer holding a sealed envelope. From the prosecutor's office, he said, then paused. And I thought you should know, ma'am. Your father's been denied bail. I nodded slowly. Thank you. When he left, I opened the envelope. Inside was a subpoena for me to testify, and a note from Mia in neat handwriting. Truth doesn't end with exposure. It ends with accountability. The courtroom was packed 3 days later. I sat behind Mia at the prosecution's table, hands folded in my lap. My father sat across the aisle, in a gray suit, his wrists bare, but his eyes defiant. My mother sat beside him, thinner than I remembered, her hair pulled into a tight bun face, pale and drawn. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder in the wood-paneled room. The trial began with the financial evidence, the ledgers, the bank transfers, the recordings from the church. Each document was another stone added to the wall between us. My father didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead, occasionally whispering to his attorney. When it was my turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. I took the stand, hands shaking slightly as I placed them on the Bible. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? The clerk asked. I do, I said. The prosecutor began with easy questions. My position as a nurse, my relationship to the defendants. Then came the recordings, the documents, the night of the gala. Each answer felt like peeling a layer off my skin. But when he asked, why did you come forward, I finally looked at my father. Because silence was killing me, I said. And because my son deserves better than the lies I grew up with. My father's expression flickered, something between rage and pride, but it was gone before I could name it. The judge called for recess after 3 hours. When I stepped outside, the press swarmed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed forward. Someone shouted, "Was this revenge?" I stopped for a second, the winter wind cutting across my face. "No," I said. "It was survival." Inside, the verdict came faster than anyone expected. Guilty on all major counts. Sentencing deferred, but the judge denied bail again. My father's jaw tightened as the words were read. My mother didn't move. When the bailiff led him away, he turned once as if to find me. I didn't look back. That night I went to the hospital to pick up Eli. He'd been staying with Angela's sister for a few days while I handled court. When he saw me, he ran straight into my arms. "Mom, are we done now?" "Yes," I whispered. "We're done." He pulled back, his small face searching mine. "Are Grandma and Grandpa in trouble?" I hesitated. "They are," I said carefully. "But we'll be okay." He nodded solemnly, the way children do when they decide to believe you even if they don't understand. "Can we go home now?" "Home," I repeated. The word felt strange in my mouth, like something I was still learning to pronounce. We drove back in silence. The snow had turned to slush, reflecting the streetlights in streaks of gold and white. When we reached our building, Eli ran ahead, his laughter echoing up the stairwell. I followed slower, my body aching from exhaustion, and something heavier, release maybe, or the space that comes after anger. Later that night, when he was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, scrolling through the news one last time. There it was again, Emerson family exposed. Underneath, a photo of me leaving the courthouse, eyes steady, chin lifted. The caption read, "Whistleblower or daughter of vengeance." I stared at it for a long time, then closed the laptop. Let them call it whatever they wanted. I knew what it was. It wasn't vengeance. It was reclamation. The next morning, I got a call from the hospital, my supervisor asking when I'd return. "Take your time," she said kindly. "You've been through hell." I looked out the window where the sun was melting the last of the snow. "No," I said softly. "I think I'm finally out of it." When I hung up, I turned toward Eli's room. He was awake, building something with his blocks. "What are you making?" I asked. He grinned. "A house," he said, "but it's got extra windows so it's never dark inside." I smiled, kneeling beside him. "That's perfect." And it was. Because for the first time I wasn't looking back at the cold. I was looking forward to warmth I would build myself. The house was quiet when the letter arrived. A month had passed since the trial, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the noise that came before. The mail slid through the slot and landed softly on the floor. I picked it up without thinking, flipping through bills and flyers until I saw the handwriting, familiar, slanted, almost fragile. It was my mother's. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where Eli and I ate breakfast every morning, and opened it. "My dearest Nora," it began. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I'd know what to do with it if you gave it. But I needed you to know that I understand now. You were right to speak. You were right to break the silence. I let fear turn me into something small. Please, don't let the same thing happen to you." The letter trembled in my hands. At the bottom, in faint, uneven ink, she'd written, "Tell Eli I'm sorry. Tell him I wish I'd been different." The date on the letter was 2 days before she died. I hadn't known she was back in the hospital. I hadn't known anything. Eli came into the room, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, are you okay?" I wiped my face quickly and smiled. "Yeah, sweetheart. Just reading something from Grandma." He tilted his head. "Is she in heaven now?" I nodded. "I think so." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she's warm there?" I swallowed hard. "I hope so." That afternoon I drove to the old family home one last time. It stood empty now, foreclosed and waiting for auction. The paint was peeling, the curtains gone. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust floated through the air like tiny ghosts. The walls still smelled faintly of cinnamon and bleach, my mother's way of pretending the house was clean, even when everything inside it was rotting. I walked from room to room, touching the corners of furniture left behind the framed photos no one had claimed. In the living room, I found the family portrait that used to hang over the fireplace. We were all there. My father's perfect smile, my mother's pearls, Julia clutching my hand, me standing stiff, too aware of the camera. I set it on the ground and leaned it against the wall. For the first time, I noticed the faint outline where the frame had protected the paint, a ghost of what once was. When I opened the cabinet near the fireplace, a box slid out. Inside were stacks of old envelopes tied together with twine. Letters my grandmother had written to my mother after I moved away. The last one, dated a few months before she died, said simply, "You can still choose warmth." I closed the box and whispered into the empty house I did. At the cemetery, the sky was overcast, the air thick with the smell of wet grass. Two graves sat side by side, one freshly covered, one weathered by years of rain. I knelt between them and laid a small bouquet of tulips, white for truth, pink for forgiveness. "Hi, Grandma," I said softly. "He's safe now. You can rest." I touched the second headstone and added, "And Mom, I think maybe you can too." Eli stood beside me, clutching my coat. "Are they sleeping?" "In a way," I said. "But they're together now." He thought about that for a second. "Then I'm not sad anymore." I smiled through the tears. "That's good." Back home, I found myself scrolling through news articles about Julia. She'd taken a plea deal, probation for cooperation. She'd moved to Oregon according to the court records. The press called her the remorseful sister. I didn't feel angry anymore, just tired. Mia called later that evening. "They finalized the asset recovery," she said. "You and Eli will inherit what's left of your grandmother's trust. It's not much, but it's clean." "I don't care about the money," I said. "I care that her name is finally free." Mia paused. "What will you do now?" I looked out the window. The streetlights cast a soft glow over the snow. "Something good," I said. "Something she'd be proud of." The next morning, I drove to the small lot my grandmother once owned near the lake. It was overgrown, forgotten. But when I stood there, I could almost hear her voice. This land should mean something. The idea came slowly at first, then all at once. I called Mia, then Angela, then a few contacts from the hospital. Within a week, I'd filed the paperwork for a nonprofit, the Haven House Foundation. A place for women and children who needed safety, warmth, and a place to start again. Angela helped me renovate an old craftsman home on the property. We painted the walls in soft creams, filled the rooms with blankets and lamps. Eli drew the logo, a little yellow house with a heart-shaped window. I framed it and hung it by the entrance. The first woman who came was named Patricia. She had 2 daughters and a bruise under her eye. She cried when she saw the beds, when she realized she didn't owe anyone an explanation. I told her, "You're safe here." She hugged me, sobbing quietly. "No one's ever said that to me before." That night, after everyone had settled, I walked through the hallways, turning off lights one by one. The house smelled like cocoa and laundry detergent, warmth and new beginnings. I stopped at the last door, Eli's. He was sitting on the floor helping Patricia's youngest daughter line up toy cars. "Bedtime soon, buddy," I said. He grinned. "Can I tell them the story about Grandma's fireplace again?" "Of course," I said. I watched as he spoke, his small voice filling the room. "Grandma had this big fire that never went out even when it snowed. And Mom said we all have to build our own fire inside us." Patricia smiled. "Your mom sounds very smart." Eli nodded seriously. "She is." Later, after everyone was asleep, I stood in the kitchen with a cup of tea, watching the snow fall outside. The old ache in my chest was still there, but it didn't hurt the same way. It felt like something I'd learned to carry instead of something that carried me. I took out my journal and began to write. Maybe revenge wasn't about winning. Maybe it was about ending the story they started before it could hurt anyone else. I closed the book, turned off the light, and let the quiet fill the house. Outside, the snow was falling softly, wrapping the world in white. Inside, the air was warm, and for the first time in years, I believed it would stay that way. 1 year later, the city was covered in the kind of gentle winter light that made everything look softer than it was. The air smelled of cinnamon and snow. I stood outside a 2-story craftsman house, painted pale yellow, watching the sign being mounted above the porch. The Haven House, a place to heal. The wood gleamed against the white sky, and for a moment I could almost see my grandmother standing beside me, nodding in quiet approval. Inside the house hummed with life. The kitchen was full of voices, women talking softly over mugs of coffee, children's laughter echoing down the hallway. The fire crackled in the living room, its warmth spilling through every corner. I'd dreamed of this for so long, but standing here now, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like coming home. Angela came down the stairs with a clipboard in hand, her hair tied back, a smile tugging at her mouth. "The reporter from Channel 7's on her way," she said. "You ready to be famous?" I laughed softly. "I'm ready to tell the truth." She handed me a folder. 3 new families are moving in next week. We're almost at capacity. That's a good problem to have, I said, taking the folder. We'll make space. At that moment, Eli came bursting through the back door, snowflakes clinging to his hair. "Mom, come see. The snow's sticking." I followed him outside where the yard was slowly turning white. He stretched his arms toward the sky, eyes wide with joy. "It's like the world's being fixed," he said. I smiled, kneeling to help him pack a snowball. "Maybe it is." When we went back inside, a woman sat by the fireplace, rocking a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. She looked up as I passed. "Thank you," she whispered, "for this place." I paused. "How long have you been here now?" 3 weeks, she said. "My daughter's finally sleeping through the night. I think she feels safe." "That's the point," I said. "Safety first. Everything else can come later." She smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "You have no idea what this means." But I did. I knew exactly what it meant to walk into warmth after years of cold. The doorbell rang just as I reached the kitchen. A young reporter stood outside, her face red from the cold. "Miss Emerson, thank you for having us. Call me Nora," I said, shaking her hand. "Come in before you freeze." Her cameraman followed, setting up near the fireplace. The reporter took a seat at the dining table, flipping open her notebook. First of all, she began, "Congratulations. It's been quite a year for you." I smiled faintly. "You could say that. You turned one of the biggest family scandals in Washington state into a movement." "How did you do it?" I looked around the room at the photos of families who'd stayed here, the drawings taped to the fridge, the faint laughter coming from the playroom. "By remembering that warmth isn't weakness," I said. "It's survival." The reporter nodded, scribbling. "And forgiveness." "Have you found that too?" I hesitated. Then said, "Forgiveness isn't a gift you give others. It's a fire you build for yourself so you don't freeze while waiting for them to apologize." For a moment she didn't write anything. Then she smiled quietly. "That's beautiful." After the interview, I walked her to the door. She turned before leaving. "One last question. If you could say something to people watching, especially those stuck in toxic families or trapped by silence, what would it be?" I met her gaze. "You can't change their cold," I said, "but you can build your own fire." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat by the window in my office, watching the snow fall steady and soft. A candle burned beside me, its flame small but constant. I opened my journal and began to write. 1 year ago, I walked into a storm carrying nothing but anger and truth. I thought revenge would be enough. But revenge ends when justice begins, and justice ends when peace takes its place. I didn't rebuild what they destroyed. I built something new. I closed the journal and glanced at the photo on the desk, my grandmother smiling, her hand resting on my shoulder from a Christmas decades ago. For the first time, looking at her didn't hurt. It felt like a promise kept. Down the hall, I heard footsteps. Eli appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom, can I sleep here?" "Of course." I patted the chair next to me. He climbed into my lap, warm and half asleep. "Do you miss Grandma?" he asked. "Every day," I said. "But I think she's here. in this house, in the warmth. He looked toward the fireplace where the flames danced quietly. Then she must be really happy. I kissed the top of his head. I think she is. We sat there for a long time just watching the snow. I thought about everything that had brought us here, the lies, the cold, the silence, and the way truth had burned through it all. The next morning, the Haven house filled with the smell of pancakes and laughter. Volunteers arrived with boxes of winter clothes. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, asked if she could donate something extra. She handed me a folded quilt, patchwork and worn. It belonged to my grandmother, she said. She used to say warmth is meant to be shared. I held it, tracing the stitched seams with my fingers. That's exactly what I believe. We spread the quilt across the couch in the living room. It looked right there like it had always belonged. That afternoon, the house buzzed with chatter. A few local donors came by to drop off supplies, and someone brought a piano. Eli pressed the keys, laughing at the sound. Angela played a few notes, then everyone joined in singing. As the music filled the room, I realized something. For years, I'd thought strength meant surviving alone, standing tall while everyone else tried to tear me down. But true strength was this creating warmth, where there had been none, giving it to others until it grew larger than the pain that started it. When the sun set, casting gold across the snow, I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold but gentle. The Haven house glowed behind me, lights shining through every window. Mia arrived, then her scarf flapping in the wind. She smiled. "You did it," she said. "We did it," I replied. She handed me a small envelope. Inside was a note written in her careful handwriting to Nora and Eli. "For every person you remind that light is stronger than cold." Mia. I hugged her, and for the first time I felt no bitterness, no exhaustion, just peace. As she drove away, I looked back at the sign one more time. The Haven house, a place to heal. The wind brushed against it, making it creak softly like a heartbeat. I whispered, "Thank you to no one, and to everyone." Then I turned off the porch light and went back inside where warmth lived. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's rebuilding. And in the glow of that little house surrounded by laughter, I finally understood warmth isn't what you find, it's what you create. If you've ever had to walk away from your own family to find peace, I hope you find it too. Tell your story. It might light the way for someone else. Because sometimes the warmest revenge is simply healing.